Sometime in the 70s, in a nondescript town near Seattle, there's a teen plague running amok. As evident from the name, it only affects teenagers. It is transmitted sexually and manifests in strange outgrowths on the bodies of the infected kids. Some of the kids are lucky, and the effects are minimal. A few bumps, maybe an ugly rash. The unlucky ones are left with extra organs and limbs and grotesque formations that explicitly mark them out as the ones with the bug. It was a horrible game of tag. Once you were tagged, you were it forever. Welcome to Black Hole, Charles Burns's cult classic graphic novel that explores the strange alienation of adolescence as the shelter and clarity of childhood are left behind for the unsure reality of adulthood. Experience the horrors of intimacy, the loss of love, and the terrifying ordeal of living with a body that grows more unfamiliar with every passing day. Issue number 1, Biology 101, a glimpse into the black hole. It began with a slit, an opening across the chest of a dead frog. It was the third period bio class, and Keith Pearson had been paired with Chris Rhodes, the cute and studious young girl whom he had a crush on. They had to dissect a frog, and, taking cue from the other boys in the class, he tried to take control of the activity in an effort to impress his partner. But as he slit open the frog's chest, a gush of formaldehyde spilled out. The hard and white guts peeked from underneath. It froze Keith still. It felt like a deja vu trip or something. A premonition. Images flashed before him. The dissected frog, an open wound on a foot, skin peeling off a woman's back, a closed palm covering a girl's genitals. He felt as if a black hole had opened up, blossoming images from the past and the present, swirling into concentric circles, overlapping each other. A snake slithering along, a strange embryo, a dented can gushing its contents, a broken beer bottle, a frog in mid-leap, a gun, the discarded butt of a still smoking joint. The images dissolved into darkness as he lost consciousness. Only a floating emptiness remained. He came back to the faces of his classmates crowding his vision. Mr. Fulner, the biology teacher, was worried, asking the other students to back up and give him room to breathe. Most of his classmates were too busy making fun of him to listen. Only Chris Rhodes wasn't laughing. She wasn't even smiling. She looked worried and somewhat scared. Oh, and before I continue, just a small request. If you have liked the video thus far, please consider subscribing to us. It may be a small click for you, but it helps us in tremendous ways to keep bringing you these marvelous long reads. And now, let's continue. Planet Zeno, a haven for the outcasts. Nobody remembers who gave it that name. Planet Zeno. It was an opening in the woods lit by white moonlight falling filtered through the crisscrossing branches of overhanging trees. It lay beyond a steep ravine, across thin jungle trails littered with mud and stickers. It was like a cocoon, a soft, insulated green world, the perfect place to get stoned. That is, until all of the weird shit started coming down. Keith, Dee, and Todd were getting stoned there. As the joint made the rounds, Todd described how he discovered that their classmate Rob Fatincani had caught the bug. He had seen Fatincani staring at himself in the washroom mirror at school. At first, he thought that he was working on a zit or something, but walking closer, he realized that it was much bigger. His approaching footsteps scared Fatincani into covering himself up, but Todd had seen what he was trying to hide. It was a tiny mouth on his chest. A disquieting hush fell on the group as they considered the ramifications of this revelation. As Keith took a charge of smoke from Dee, he saw a guy peeking from behind the tree line. Intrigued, they walked into the woods and found a bunch of narrow trails leading deeper inside. They passed strange totems tied to the trees, dolls with shaved heads, empty cans and bones, before stumbling upon a makeshift tent. Todd reasoned that it belonged to the Peeping Tom Keith had spotted. He and Dee promptly began ransacking the place, helping themselves to the candy bars and playboys littered inside. Keith walked on. The woods deepened and converged, rising along an incline, leading to crook among the trees where something lay swaying in the wind, spread like a cloth across two branches. It was skin. A girl had shed her skin and discarded it in the forest. It was a map of her life, marked with moles and childhood scars. It filled Keith with a strange sickness. The snap of a twig alerted him to being watched. He turned to see a grotesque face looking back at him. It resembled one of those cheap, rubber Halloween masks seen in dime movies. The flesh was twisted and covered in boils, the eyes tilted and displaced, and the mouth all busted up with broken teeth sticking out of pink gristle. It looked too messed up to be human. Nonetheless, Keith knew that it was. His words were distorted into gibberish by his broken visage. "Gawa Uwa!" he kept screaming. It took Keith a while to realize that he was asking him to go away. As he quickly turned to go, he saw others moving around in the underbrush and noticed trails leading to more sad little forts littered with everyday refuse. Meanwhile, his two friends had found a yearbook stashed amidst the debris of the first tent. It belonged to Rick the Dick Holstrom, a classmate who had presumably disappeared from the school roster since he caught the bug. His tent had been completely trashed by the apathetic duo, which Keith mildly protested. Dee and Todd excused their actions, citing Rick's status as a geek. Their activities were observed by an unknown figure hiding behind a tree. A dream of things to come. Chris Rhodes lay sleeping, surrounded by the detritus of the day. Her dreams were uneasy, invaded by strange images. She stood by a lake, surrounded by naked guys whose genitals transformed into strange corkscrews. Or maybe it was a pigtail or a snake. She was naked as well, standing in a sea of broken glass. A shard stung her left foot, and although she pulled it out, the pain refused to dissipate. There was something else in her skin. It looked like a cigarette, but was actually a rolled-up piece of paper that revealed the picture of a snake, half submerged in a body of water, its midsection making an arch above the surface. The image zoomed out to reveal a rock formation jutting out of the water body, with an arch-like opening at its navel paralleling the snake's posture. In its shadow, a bunch of silhouetted figures were treading water, eating the soggy French fries and old burgers floating along. Chris recoiled in disgust and was noticed by the nice guy from biology class. He looked concerned and asked her not to eat any of the trash and offered her a potato as something good to eat instead, but it had strange tentacular roots and blinking eyes, so she refused the offer. The water around them tumbled into a cyclonic spiral and began to pull her under as the people in the background transmogrified into grotesque, monstrous creatures. The nice guy's body twisted into a snake and coiled around her in a suffocating embrace as he kept wanting to help her. She woke up in the grip of anxiety and sweat, her skin peeling off her back in a nasty tear that looked like a mouth, a blank eye, or a genital opening. Dismayed by the dream, she pulled at her face, which came off like a mask. Before long, the skin of her entire body had been peeled off in a continuous stretch. Held in her hand, it stared back like a distorted reflection. She flung it out of her tent in disgust, and it flew through the air, coming to rest some distance away, stuck between the branches of a tree. Issue number 2, racing towards something, holding your breath till the big reveal. Chris Rhodes sat by a dark and muddy lake, staring at its shimmering water. She was attending a kegger, but sat from the hullabaloo, sipping beer from a disposable cup. The Herfy's logo, a big dumb cow ready for the slaughterhouse, looked back at her from the cup. It seemed like the cow was saying, "Eat me." Chris didn't realize that she had said the last bit aloud until it elicited laughter from two of her friends. They were concerned because she was sitting alone and had come to ask her if she was all right. She blamed the self-appointed exclusion on her period cramps and told them that she would join them. It was embarrassing to be heard talking to herself. Her friends probably thought that she was nuts. Maybe she was. Chris still felt hungover from last night and her stomach was in knots. The whole week had been nuts. Ever since the party at Marcy's house, it had started wonderfully. Marcy's parents were not home and the house had been set up beautifully with candles, music and snacks. Booze was on its way. Plenty of cute guys were vying for Chris's attention, but she only had eyes for Rob Fasincani. She had noticed him around school before, had never had the courage to talk to him. That night was different. There was something dark and sexy pulling them towards each other. Their chat began with a discussion of music, tread through a conversation about preferred beer brands and funny advertisements, before Rob suggested going outside on the pretext of smoking a cigarette. Chris readily agreed, taking a bottle of wine for the road, and the two stepped out. It was a cool, beautiful evening, with gusty winds pushing clouds past the full moon. Chris found herself lost in Rob's dark eyes and was at a loss of words. She nervously commented on Rob's choice of cigarettes, Cools. It was like smoking toothpaste. Rob took the light ribbing in stride, jovially replying that he only smoked what he was. Not wanting to return to the party, Chris suggested that they go for a walk and head for the cemetery. Rob was hesitant about their destination, but acquiesced when Chris teased him about being scared. They opened their bottle of wine and started on their way. By the time they reached the cemetery, Chris felt as if she was possessed. A warmth had spread throughout her body. She led Rob to a bench and kissed him. She knew it was crazy and dangerous, but she didn't care. The wine had taken hold, so they could reasonably blame it on the booze. But she knew that it was much more than that. Before it could go any further, Rob stopped her. He had something to say, but Chris assured him that she knew. Rob was puzzled. But how? Chris assuaged his worries. It doesn't matter how. It's just you and me. That's all that matters. He was shy and gave her a soft kiss on her cheek. It was wet and sexy and cold to the touch of the wind. She pulled him in for a real kiss, and they were gone. She got up on his lap, and he held her tight, hands on her hips, such that she could feel him, hard, straining against her. Surrounded by a million dead bodies, they were the source of life, held together in need and desire. He tried to lift her, but lost balance, and the two of them tumbled to the ground. She pulled him down, into the damp grass, and they slid out of their pants and into each other. Everything was quiet, except for the wind rustling through the trees and their quickening breaths rushing towards a conclusion as they moved against each other. Chris closed her eyes and saw the pleasure bloom in her mind, like a light appearing at the horizon. It grew in glory, her heart pumping faster and faster, until the light was the sun, spreading all across her senses in an explosion of pleasure, before slowly dissipating in concentric beats against the horizon of blue light. She opened her eyes to see Rob still moving against her, inside her, his eyes closed. She kissed his neck, pulling open his shirt to reveal more of his body. That is when she saw something weird. It was a small mouth at the meeting of his throat and chest. It opened as he came, gurgling out some tiny, awful noises, like a fish on dry land, gasping for air. Chris screamed in disbelief, and Rob looked at her with concern. Had he hurt her somehow? No, she had just seen something strange on his neck, and thus the reverie was broken. Rob's perfect dark eyes turned cold. He thought that Chris knew. Chris was stupefied. Knew what? There was nothing left to say. They separated and put their clothes on, took a last swig of their wine and lit individual cigarette on their way home. It was over. It was so shitty, so cold and shitty. The week felt like it would never end. She could only confide her feelings in her journal as Rob refused to talk to her, always postponing conversations with one excuse or another. Although her friends pestered her about the events of that evening, she was too embarrassed and scared to talk about it. Her parents had also noticed the shift in her mood and were concerned, and to top it all off, her period was late. Fortunately, it finally came the night before, announcing its arrival with a painful cramp, but it didn't make her feel any better about herself. After putting her younger brother to sleep and taking the usual precautions, she spent the rest of the night sitting before the dull glow of the TV, getting drunk. Chris's reflection on her shitty past week was intruded upon by Steve, a schoolmate who had brought along a refill of beer. He informed her that two kids called Rick and Tom were talking about going swimming, but were being jerks about it. Despite the lingering nip in the air, Chris said that she wouldn't mind going swimming. She loved swimming. At the gathering, Rick was ready to go skinny dipping in the cold waters of the lake, but wanted his friends to pitch in money for the stunt. When Chris arrived, she was asked if she would pitch into the pool of money they were crowdsourcing for Rick's dare. She refused, instead offering to join him for the swim, albeit in her underwear. The whole gang hooted and hollered as Rick stripped down off his clothes. But when Chris shed hers, a sudden and uncomfortable hush fell on the group. Everyone stared at her in varying degrees of shock. An unsettled Chris stepped into the lake, wondering what she had done wrong. Maybe she had a stain on her underwear. She was too tired to care about such frivolous things. She dove deep into the lake, going under and under and under, wondering if she could end it all, drowning the pain, the strange humiliations and confusions inherent to life. She knew she couldn't. When she resurfaced, the shore was empty. Her mind still reeled from their strange reactions, and she wondered if she was making too big a deal out of it. They had acted like jerks, but it was probably nothing. She would be okay. She would get her act together and be perfectly fine. She knew it. She stood up and walked out of the water. A scattered line of tears ran down the skin of her back, parallel to her spine. Unbeknownst to her, she had caught the bug. Issue number 3. Who's Chris? Spilled secrets. Rob lay asleep, and Chris loomed large over his dreams. He walked across the woods, shifting through dense foliage, until he reached a campfire surrounded by strange, deformed people. He walked on, beyond the scattered debris and their suspicious stares, finding himself in a dilapidated cemetery. A worm with a human face raised its head above a headstone and tilted its head, as if trying to recognize him. That is when Chris called to him from somewhere beyond the page. She sat leaning against a headstone with legs folded up and pants crumpled at her feet. She was just where she had left him. Ignoring his attempts to apologize, she put a cigarette between her lips and asked him for a light. The cigarette twisted into a strange, organic creature, splitting off into multiple heads. They thickened, growing bumps and thorns, looking like a strange mixture between a leech and a sea anemone. Chris disregarded Rob's warning against smoking the cigarette. It was her favorite brand. She believed that old saying, "Smoke what you are." Rob brought out his matchbox, but they had picked up the serpentine habit. He tried to explain the predicament to Chris, but she had gotten hold of a candle, lit her cigarette with it. Right as the cigarette caught fire, a voice from somewhere else wrenched him away from the dream. "Who's Chris?" Rob woke up to find his girlfriend, Lisa, leaning over him in bed. Her eyes brimmed with tears. She asked again, "Who's Chris?" The night had begun well. Lisa's parents were away, so she had brought Rob home and cooked him a nice dinner. They had gone to bed happy and satisfied, but as he fell asleep, the little mouth on his chest started speaking. "Oh, Chris. God, I am sorry, Chris. I am so sorry." Rob was horrified and tried to defend himself. He was dreaming after all, but Lisa had had enough. Perhaps Rob didn't want to be with her anymore because the effects of the infection were showing on her. Maybe her webbed hands disgusted Rob, and he wanted to move on and find a clean girl. Rob's protestations were of no avail. Lisa had made up her mind. She put on her robe and asked him to leave. She didn't care that it was 3 in the morning and Rob didn't have anywhere to go. She just wanted him gone. There were going to be no more talks about the relationship. Lisa was done talking. She simply wanted him out of her life. Cut. Peeping Tom. The joint Keith was smoking was a sidewinder. He tried to fix it with his spit. It was Friday, a warm afternoon announcing the approaching summer. Keith and Todd were at a kegger down by the swimming hole. Dee was at the gathering, getting refills of beer. Keith wasn't much of a drinker, but the dope Todd scored was killer. It cost $15 a lid, but was worth it. Todd bought it from some college guys who lived up on 40th Street. In the meantime, Dee arrived with their refills. Todd had serious cotton mouth and was mildly miffed with Dee for having taken so long, but Dee was carrying some gossip, which got them intrigued. While he was waiting in line, he realised that Rick Ames was going swimming. Suddenly, Chris Rhodes, the girl from Keith's biology class, who he was always going on about, wanted to go too. As she stripped down to her underwear, everyone saw that she had the bug. Her back was all messed up. The skin on her backbone was like breaking open. Keith was shocked. Maybe it was something else, he suggested, but Dee was adamant that it was the bug. "She's got it. Everyone saw it." "But why would she let everyone see?" Dee shrugged. "Why would anyone want to go swimming in that ice-cold lake in their underwear?" Keith sat in silence for a moment or two and then got up. Thinking he had upset him, Dee tried to obliquely apologize. He wasn't trying to be a jerk. He was only sharing what he had seen. Keith knew that. He wasn't angry. He needed to take a leak. It troubled him to know that Chris had done it. The only way to catch the bug was by having sex with a sick kid. Keith had noticed her getting hit on by many different guys at school. It was not far-fetched to think that she had a boyfriend. Yet, it was a truth that was too awful to consider. He couldn't see her doing something like that, Keith lamented, ever telling his friends about her. He found a secluded place in the woods where he could take a leak. "This is it. This is all it's ever gonna be," he thought. "It'll never get better. It'll never get better. I'll always be like this." His morose internal monologue was interrupted by the arrival of Chris Rhodes. She was some distance away, beyond a curtain of trees and foliage. She was in her underwear and hadn't noticed him standing nearby. Before he could understand what was happening, she had stripped off her brassiere, presumably wet from the swim in the lake, and was putting on her shirt. Keith felt like a pervert, a peeping Tom, but he couldn't look away. As she put her pants on, she suddenly screamed in pain and fell down. She had hurt herself somehow. Keith was afraid that if he walked out, his voyeurism would be exposed. But his body acted of its own volition. He had slipped out of his hiding place before he knew it. Chris was understandably scared by Keith's sudden appearance, but he justified it by saying that he was taking a walk and had been alerted by her screams. What happened? Her left foot had been cut by a broken piece of glass. The piece was still in there, and it ached terribly. Much to his surprise, Keith found himself taking control. He instructed Chris to keep her foot up to stem the blood flow. Touching her, even in this situation, felt strange and exhilarating. Enveloped in pain, she didn't seem to mind. There was a deep, vertical gash across the foot. Keith's stomach turned as he looked at it. It resembled the frog's dissected chest in biology class. He had seen something similar in his delirious visions before everything had gone black, but he couldn't let it happen again. He needed to prove to Chris that he could take care of her. Keith carefully dug out the big chunk of glass lodged in the cut. Then he took off his shirt and ripped it open to bandage the cut. He tied it gently, making sure that it was not too tight. It would hold well until she got home. As he helped her up, she asked him to put his sweatshirt on. He might get cold, although the weather had been pleasantly warm of late. That is what had enticed Chris to go for a swim. She had come into the woods to change into her dry clothes. Keith feigned surprise when Chris mentioned her swimming escapade and quickly maneuvered the conversation away from the topic, warning her to be careful of all the broken glass littering the place. Guys get drunk and they start busting up their bottles. Chris was feeling better. Her foot still hurt, but she could walk. She would hitch a ride with her friends. They must be nearby. She bid adieu to Keith with a smile. Thanks for everything. You've been real sweet. That was all he needed. He stared at his hands, which were marked with her blood. It was sign. He didn't know when or how, but Chris was going to be his someday. It had to happen. Issue number 4, Bag Action, High Time. A week had passed since the kegger, but Chris still loomed large over Keith's psyche. Todd was taking Keith to score some weed, but he was far away, lost in thoughts of his crush. He knew she was sick, but wasn't bothered by it. In fact, he thought it might help his chances of getting with her. But his romantic fantasies had been crushed when he met her back at school after the weekend. She had been friendly as always, but there was no special connection between them as he had imagined. She had come to class on Monday and Tuesday, but had been absent since then. Todd noticed that Keith was a little off and asked him what was up. He shrugged it off, non-committally. As they approached the grey house where the college guys lived, Todd warned him to keep his mouth shut. I'll introduce you and everything, but let me handle the business end of it, all right? Keith was happy to oblige. The sound of the buzzer at the door was greeted by furious barks from inside the house. The angry dog was quickly subdued by a disembodied voice who asked them who they were. Todd nervously responded that he had talked to someone called Bert on the phone. The mention of that name opened up the door. A mustachioed man welcomed into the house. Inside it was dark and filled with smoke. 3 men sat huddled around a low table, littered with stacks of paper, open beer cans, and a couple of overflowing ashtrays. Bert was sitting at the center of the room and quickly recognized Todd. He knew that they were in the market for a little bag action and opened his stash box to display his stash weed. It's called Michoacan Lotus Blossom. Todd picked a brick and accepted Bert's offer to roll a joint and test its potency. Bert picked out a bud from the pack and assured them that it would take them where they wanted to go. The joint circled around the room, passing Keith by in due time, but it didn't get him where he wanted to go. His friends were always giving him grief about this. No matter where he was, he always wanted to be somewhere else. He wanted to be deep in the woods, leaning against a tree, staring at something natural and beautiful. The image of Chris Rhodes bloomed in his mind, lying naked on the forest floor. As he slowly approached, her face turned. She was looking at him. Her expression betrayed a curious mixture of fear and concern. Keith got up from his seat. He couldn't tolerate these college dipshits droning on about their stoned escapades. He placated Todd's concern by saying that he was thirsty and needed something to drink. Hearing that, the college guys requested him to get beers for everyone in the room. The stuff was doing a number on their throats. The hallway to the kitchen was a dark tunnel and Keith couldn't find the light switch, but he soldiered on. He would die if he didn't get something to drink. He entered the kitchen and was shocked into stillness. A young woman stood inside. She was naked from the waist down and had a thin vest on top. She was standing with her back to the door and quickly turned around, surprised by his arrival. But even in that minuscule moment, Keith had noticed it. She had a tail. He knew he shouldn't stare, but he just couldn't stop. His gaze washed over her, from her deep blue eyes with huge dilated pupils, thick black hair lapped against porcelain white skin, down the curve of her body to the meeting of her legs, which she covered in playful modesty. Oops! He was mortified with embarrassment, but the woman wasn't perturbed. She gracefully wrapped a kitchen towel around her waist like a hula skirt and did a sweet little dance. Keith couldn't help but smile, which pleased her. She grabbed him a beer and offered to make him a sandwich. It was the best sandwich in the world. Put 2 slices of bologna on the bread, a bit of an iceberg lettuce for the crunch, and add a dollop of Miracle Whip. You gotta use the Miracle Whip or it's just no good. She took a bite and purred with pleasure. Perfect! She pushed it towards Keith. He said that he wasn't hungry, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. He could see her teeth marks on the bread and the thin layer of pink, shiny meat inside as she held it up to his face. It was strangely suggestive. Finally, he gave in and took it from her. She watched him chew, bite into it, and was pleased when he said that he liked it. She made another one for herself and suggested that they take it downstairs. She wanted to show him her room. Keith was unsure about the proposition. After all, he was supposed to bring beer for Bert and the other guys. But she told him not to worry. They were big boys and could take care of themselves. Despite the uneasiness in the pit of his stomach, he agreed to go with her. The staircase was dark, but Keith could still make out the shape of her body. He could see her tail pressed against the back of her towel, twitching intermittently. He felt himself getting hard. When they reached the door of her room, she looked back at him in anticipation. "So, are you ready?" The room was wall to wall with beautifully strange artwork. He was greeted by strange sculptures, smiling masks, and numerous sketches and paintings. Keith couldn't believe that all of them had been created by her. She urged him to take a look as she put on some electronic music. He kept stealing glances at her, watching her wolf down the sandwich in big bites. Even that looked sexy. She said that she hadn't eaten all day, perhaps because she was tripping. That was the reason for her wild eyes and dilated pupils. This sandwich was her comfort food. It helped center her. She looked at Keith curiously. Did he know what she meant? He seemed a bit off-center. She didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she offered him a pipe full of hash. It was brand new. She had carved it out of soapstone. It carried the skeletal and skull motif that was prevalent in her art. They lit up and passed the pipe between them. The hit from the stuff seemed to open up his mind to the art. It was dark and surreal, with motifs borrowed from insect anatomy, skeletons and demonic imagery. Keith felt that she had somehow figured out exactly what she was doing. Drifting from one picture to another, he stopped before the drawing of a naked boy, gagged and tied to a tree. It brought back the memory of the woods and, along with it, a deep sadness. He wanted to express his appreciation of the art, but couldn't find the words. The sheer presence of it was overwhelming, and he wished he was capable of creating something this evocative. He played the guitar and wrote songs occasionally, but none of it was this good. She was flattered by the praise, but felt that he was troubled by something. She saw it in his eyes. Keith averted his gaze on cue and sheepishly confessed that it was about a girl. She seemed to understand. She pulled him gently into bed and asked him to relax. He could trust her. She wouldn't hurt him. He lay on the bed and felt her body press down on him. He wanted to focus on his sadness, the image of Chris lying naked on the forest floor, but it was overcome by her presence. The glimpse of her tail, the peak of her pubic hair. He could feel her breath on his neck, warm and sweet. She knew he had seen her tail. She knew that he had liked it. The intensity of their strange conjugation was abruptly broken by the arrival of Bert. He apologized cheerfully for barging in, hoping he hadn't walked in on something. He had come looking for Keith because Todd was worried. He thought he'd split, having walked out the back door, but Bert had a pretty good idea where he might be. The smirk on the older guy's face made Keith uneasy, and he stood up to go. Todd wanted to get going. Bert looked at the woman, staring longingly at Keith, and mockingly confirmed his suspicion as he left the room. Maybe he had walked in on something. They were left in an awkward solitude. She wanted him to stay, but the spell had been broken. Keith left her sitting alone on the bed with a dry goodbye. "So, I'll see you around, okay?" "Right, I'll see you around." Cookout. Campfire Tales. Evicted from Lisa's house, Rob made his way into the woods where the infected kids had set up a makeshift community. They were sitting around a campfire, roasting hot dogs to a crisp burn, and passing a ketchup bottle among themselves. Their petty bickering over the lack of better food was interrupted by the sound of someone approaching. Immediately on alert, they prepared to defend themselves and got armed with a club. Rob, emerging from beyond the shadow of the foliage, was surprised and unsettled by their hostility. When he had decided to drop by for a quick visit, he hadn't expected his friends to be so on edge. His friends, although happy to see him after a long while of absence, were intrigued by his appearance. 4 in the morning was not exactly a prime time for a friendly visit. Reluctantly, Rob revealed that he had been thrown out of Lisa's house after a fight. When pressed for a reason, he adamantly circumvented the conversation with vague replies, claiming that she was starting to lose it. She was still trying to pass at school by bandaging her hand, but the act was becoming unsustainable. Her parents were asking her questions, and the school things messed up too. The last statement was said pointedly to a guy called Dave, perhaps referring to some kind of communal ostracization taking place under the school authorities' aegis. Rob's quiet and chill demeanor got violently altered when he was asked about the mouth on his chest. He claimed that he had already been interrogated by Lisa and did not wish to go through it again. His friends were simply expressing their concern, having not seen him in a while, and asked him to relax. This angered him more. They did not seem very relaxed when he was approaching them. It looked like they were preparing to kill him with the club. This elicited a guilty silence from the group as they shared furtive looks among themselves. Rob was at a loss. "What's going on? Come on, tell me." Something strange was going on in the woods. One of their friends, Lana, had been missing for a few days. Roy had recently found a severed arm in the woods, and weird sculptures made of bone, string, and all kinds of little pieces of junk kept popping up all over the woods, hanging from trees. Someone was up to something strange. That is why they had been so nervous upon hearing Rob's approaching footsteps. Unbeknownst to them, a bald and scarred young boy stood hidden behind a tree, listening to their conversation. He held a metal rod in his hand. Seeing double, meeting halfway, Chris was smoking away in the can, contemplating her predicament and planning to run away to the sea. How could they accept the reality of their situation so easily? She knew that she would never be like them again. Neither did she want to be. She discarded the burnt butt of the cigarette into the toilet and walked out of the stall, surprising the girls standing outside. They knew somebody was smoking up a storm, but didn't know it was Chris. They quickly bid her farewell and escaped from the washroom. Chris could tell that they knew about her infection. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Nothing seemed to have changed. She felt that she didn't deserve to look so normal. She was a monster. Walking out of the washroom, she ran into Rob. He had seen her enter and had been waiting outside. Her mind reeled from coming face to face with him. The big speech she had planned and rehearsed, telling him off for his despicable actions, dissolved into oblivion. Rob touched her shoulder and she melted. He wanted to talk to her and suggested that they go for a walk outside down to the park. Chris agreed. His touch had made all the memories of the day come tumbling back. This was the first time that Chris was cutting class. She had never even considered doing it before. They walked down the streets in silence as a grave storm blew in from the west, imposing darkness. The pale yellow light on the horizon turned everything flat. Rob's hands trembled as he tried to light a cigarette. He was scared. They had walked off the school grounds, beyond the parking lot and the 7-Eleven, down a dirt path into the park before Rob found his voice. He was having difficulty finding the words. Chris kept quiet. He felt awful about that night. He had tried to tell her about his infection, but when she said that she knew, he thought that someone had already told her, and she was cool with it. He looked at her earnestly. He would not have gone ahead with it if he knew the truth. He would never have done something like that deliberately, especially to her. He wanted to take things back, make things all right, but it was not possible anymore. Chris didn't say anything. Perhaps Rob was waiting for her to respond, but she didn't have anything to say. They stood in silence, staring at the overpass before them. That's when it started pouring. Rob took her hand and they ran up the hillside, scrambling for shelter. By the time they reached the safe shade under a pine tree's branches, the spell had been broken. Sitting there, giddy and out of breath, with the rain sounds surrounding them like a canopy, the dull pain and confusion of the last few weeks seemed to suddenly disappear. As they caught their breath and lit themselves another pair of cigarettes, Chris knew that she was going to share her story with him. She found out about her infection on the day of the kegger. They were returning from the lakeshore in Marcy's car. She was yapping on about the rude silence she had faced while going swimming as she sipped on warm, flat beer. She was edging towards a comfortable buzz when she noticed that Marcy had been completely silent throughout the ride. She asked her if something was wrong. Marcy looked at her with an expression of pity and pain. God, Chris. You don't know, do you? At Marcy's house, they locked themselves in the bathroom so that she could examine herself in the mirror. She reached around and felt the soft openings, a series of loose tears running down her spine. Unlike a wound, it was painless and didn't resist her touch. She had to stop. Everything suddenly felt too much. They informed her parents that she was staying the night at Marcy's and went out to Herfy's to grab something to eat. Some of the infected kids were there, loitering around the garbage cans, picking through the trash for something to eat. Marcy was disgusted. Why do they have to come here and ruin everybody's good time? With those words, the reality of the situation set in for Chris. Although she didn't show her deformity as visibly as those other kids, she was still one of them. She urged Marcy to leave the joint and get something to drink. They got some guys to buy them drinks and drove up to Golden Garden. It was a Friday night and the place was packed, so they walked down the beach until they found a quiet place. They sat down and, looking out at the ebb and flow of the water, she told Marcy everything while drinking the wine. Her memory of the night was fragmented beyond that, swayed by the alcohol's effect. There was a lot of falling down, walking barefoot and staring into tidal pods, until things became double and triple before fading into a darkness where all the images of her subconscious coagulated into a strange, ugly continuity. Suddenly, she was dry and awake in Marcy's room. It was spinning around her, making her terribly sick. She untangled herself from the uncomfortable embrace of the sleeping bag. As her legs slid out, she saw loose skin hanging off her wounded foot. She had had enough. She grabbed the skin with both hands and pulled. It came off in a painless motion in one big piece. She went into the shower and stayed under it till the hot water ran cold. Standing beside Rob, she shivered. Rob pulled her in for a hug and she kissed him. The warmth poured back into her. Why did it take so long for him to talk to her? Why had he been ignoring her at school? Rob couldn't really say. Maybe because he felt guilty. It was hard to explain. The curtain of anger lifted. They wanted to know everything about each other. Chris wanted him to show her his neck. Rob was apprehensive. He thought it was gross, but Chris insisted. Nothing about him was gross. As he pulled down the collar of his shirt, revealing the thin slit of a mouth, Chris kissed it. It tasted warm and salty, clean and sharp, like the ocean. A tiny, trembling tongue fluttered inside, softly touching her own. Rob gently pushed her away, a look of distress on his face. "You're going to drive me crazy." Chris asked if it felt bad. Rob shook his head. No, it felt good, but it was also strange. No one had ever done it before. It had stopped raining by then, and he suggested that they go back to his place. There was still time till his mum got off work, but Chris wanted to stay there a while longer. She would have stayed there forever if she could. Issue number 6, Window Pane, a trip down memory lane. Dee and Todd were supposed to pick Keith up from home, but they were late. His parents were watching some crappy made-for-TV movie and sincerely enjoying it, laughing aloud from time to time. The idea of being stuck at home all night seemed too awful to consider. Finally, the sound of Dee's horn sounded outside and Keith quickly fled the house. Relief washed over him as he entered the car, but he was still quite angry about the delay. "Where were you guys?" Their glassy eyes and big smiles answered his question before they spoke. They were high on acid. Dee handed him a hit of window pane. The acid looked like plastic, a tiny dark chip stuck between two pieces of Scotch tape. His friends observed him as he put the strip on his tongue. He was filled with a giddy panic in anticipation of the acid to kick in. He asked Dee where they were headed. "Jill's. Her oldies are gone for the weekend. It's time to party." This announcement immediately dampened his spirits. He didn't want to be stuck there all night. His friends tried to cheer him up. Janet and Karen were supposed to be coming as well. He liked Janet, didn't he? Maybe he would get a little action for once. It wasn't very effective. The first wave hit him as they pulled up to Jill's highway. The sun had set, but the sky remained a deep, dark blue. He could see the first stars coming out. Black trees swayed in the distance, silhouetted by the fading light, while the lawn glowed a beautiful, radiant green. He didn't want to leave it, but his friends were getting impatient, so he quit his loitering and followed them inside. Jill welcomed them brightly and led them to the kitchen where everything was bright and jumpy. Her older sister was waiting by the phone and addressed them sarcastically, barely hiding her contempt. Keith was slightly creeped out by her. Jill laid out a bowl of Cheetos and a couple of beers. In the acid haze, seen under the harsh kitchen lights, the Cheetos looked ridiculous. Todd picked one up and proclaimed that they were dried alien turds found on planet Zeno. Keith, amused by the invention, said that it was orange because all their food was orange, to which Todd said the whole planet and everything on it was orange. Jill's sister continued to make snide comments and scolded her sister for trying to use the phone. She was waiting for a call. Time seemed to have stopped as they sat there, laughing and talking, until the phone suddenly rang. That's when things started to go bad. Jill's sister was trying to act cute and sexy on the phone. Watching her transform her coarse and ugly voice into a tender rendition made Keith uneasy. The conversation didn't go her way. She hung up the phone and cursed. Jill's sincere concern was coldly rejected as she informed her that she was leaving. Although she didn't care what she did with her stoned-out friends, she warned her not to trash the house. Those cruel words set the mood for the evening. They tried to laugh it off, but the damage had been done. Jill asked them to see what was on TV while she called Janet. Unable to catch a hold of her, she settled down before the TV with the rest of them. It took a while for Keith to realise that they were watching the same movie his parents had been watching at home. It was Friday Friday night, and here they were, fried out of their minds and sitting in front of the television. Dee and Jill had been getting it on for a while, much to Keith's discomfort. He kept stealing glances despite himself as wet kissing sounds rose above the movie's soundtrack. Soon, they excused himself and shifted to Jill's bedroom. Keith was dissatisfied with the turn of events. He wanted to go out and have fun, like that time they had all gone to the reservoir and done mushrooms. He didn't think Janet and Karen were coming and considered the night to be ruined. This annoyed Todd. Keith always wanted to be someplace else. They couldn't just leave Dee behind. In any case, he had spent the last couple of weeks moping over a girl with whom he had no chance. Todd mellowed a little after the tirade and suggested that he have a little patience. Janet and Karen might be a little late, but they would reach there eventually. A sulky Keith excused himself to go to the bathroom, in sharp contrast to the darkness of the living room. The bathroom was brightly lit and initiated another shift of mood. He stood frozen in the hard yellow light, staring at his black and glassy eyes in the mirror as a distant fear rose in him. He heard soft moaning sounds drifting in from an adjacent room, the sounds of Dee and Jill having sex. The picture of a forest on the bathroom wall transported him back to the woods, staring at Chris in her underwear. Another time when he was taking a leak, he imagined a different reality where they were together, out in some winding forest road, headed who knows where. In the background, he could hear Dee going too fast as Jill requested him to slow down to no avail. "Come on, Dee, it kind of hurts. Just slow down, okay?" He couldn't do it anymore. He wanted to try and convince Todd to leave, but when he walked into the living room, he saw him staring blankly at the TV, his face pulled in a horrible toothy grin. It took him a while to realize that the grotesque sound emanating from his mouth was laughter. Keith made his way out of the house. He decided that if he walked long enough, everything would be all right. His train of thought was interrupted when he came upon Jill's sister crying in a car. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in black rivulets as yelled at him to get out of there. Walking didn't help. Paranoia gripped him as everyone seemed to stare at him. He passed by shop windows displaying ungodly things, which made no sense to him. He reached the overpass near the school, where a trail led into the woods. It was a natural environment. It would surely make things better. He had travelled the dirt road down to Ravenna Park Path a million times, but today it turned into a fleshy thing under his feet. He knelt down and touched it to reassure himself that it was only dirt, but it transformed into membranous skin. He was on the back of a moving, living thing that made low, moaning sounds. He looked up and saw its eye, a dead and empty hole, staring down at him from the sky. He fled from the path, but it followed him through reflections of light and echoes of its moans. Within the woods, the light was fragmented by the trees, shining upon strange sculptures on the way. The wind rustled through the branches, leaving remnants of moans that sounded like Dee grunting in the next room in consort with Jill. And then he fell down. His legs were gone, his lungs burnt fire, and the silver light continued to push its way into him. Horrible things flashed through his mind, like the image of a naked boy, gagged and tied to a tree. He tried to pull himself together, afraid that his mind would be lost forever in the maze of the trip. "I'm just too stoned is all. It's nothing." He had to get back to normal and find a way out of the woods. Then he could catch a bus and go home. That's when he noticed something on the ground. It was a trick of the high, he told himself, but he knew it wasn't. The severed hand lying on the ground was real. He could smell the putrid odour of rotten meat just as well as he could see the pale skin and the black crust of blood. He stared at it for a long time. It was time to leave. A switch seemed to have flipped inside him. Something had been turned off. In the distance, he noticed the orange glow of a campfire. He walked towards it. The attendants were shocked to see him, but quickly realized that he was loaded and scared. When he told them about the severed arm, they asked him to sit and offered him some grape soda. It had been his favorite as a child. As it poured down his parched throat, he realized how thirsty he was. He looked back at the faces gathered around him. They were deformed kids, infected with the bug. They were being nice to him, but he still found it difficult to look straight at them. Some of them looked familiar, while others had been messed up beyond recognition. They were waiting, all waiting for him to tell them about the arm, but he was having difficulty finding the words. Someone suggested that he start from the beginning and tell them everything, so that is what he did. He told them about doing acid with Dee and Todd, Jill's sister crying in the car, and the arm lying abandoned in the woods, its flesh torn and pale and rotten. Things had been going bad for a while, but this was too much. Once he was done, he felt as empty and pure as the flames dancing before him. There was no sound other than the crackling of the fire. He looked around and realized that all the faces, whether normal or deformed, glowed with a warm internal light. They reassured him that he was safe there and offered to walk him out to a trail that led to Ravenna. Keith chose to stay there for a while. Issue number 7, Under Open Skies, Premonitions. Chris and Rob were headed to the sea. It was going to be the best day of their lives. It was drizzly and grey on the bus ride to school, which depressed Chris a little. She had waited a long time for this. She met Rob in the school parking lot and drove downtown to catch a ferry. They stood at the back of the ship and watched the city fade away in the distance. By the time they reached Bremerton, the skies had cleared up. While Rob had never been to the beach, Chris was a regular, having visited it with her family and her church group, and expertly navigated the directions. Soon, the smell of the ocean heralded their destination. They stayed away from the crowded camping grounds and found themselves a quiet corner. An excited Chris led Rob running across a long stretch until they reached a rock formation she was familiar with. It looked like a mountain range jutting out of the water with an arch-like opening at its foot. Chris quickly stripped off her clothes and jumped into the water, but Rob tiptoed in hesitantly. The water was cold. Chris invited him closer to her, deeper into its reaches. She would warm him up. Splashing and playing in the water, Rob suddenly got a sweet and distant look on his face. He gazed at Chris and said that he loved her. She was concerned. He shouldn't say it if he didn't mean it, but Rob did mean it. He would never lie to her. Chris returned his gaze. She loved him too. She would love him forever, no matter what. She too was telling the truth. After a lunch of fruits and sandwiches, they spent a lazy afternoon lying on the beach, walking about and talking the time away. As the sun chased the horizon, they slowly gathered everything, retrieved the stuff they needed from the car, and headed to a grassy bluff overlooking the ocean. It was Chris's favourite camping spot. The wind rose cold, so they changed into their warm clothes and settled down to dine. They had everything, from black olives and an avocado to French bread, salami and cheese. There was also a bottle of wine that they took turns sipping from. It was just like their first meeting in the cemetery, only much better. This time, they were in love. The wine warmed Chris's stomach, which slowly spread to the meeting of her legs. As darkness fell and the first stars bloomed in the blue-black sky, they retired to bed under the open sky. The first time they made love was hard and fast, over too soon. Once Rob was ready again, Chris climbed on top of him. This time they went slow. There was no need to hurry. They had all the time in the world. When they were finally done, Chris rolled off onto her back. She was exhausted and satiated, buoyed by the cool wind rushing in from the ocean, and felt empty and weightless. There were a few lingering kisses, sleepy and salty. Wrapped in Rob's arms, Chris could feel him drift off to sleep, his breathing deep and even. That is when it started. The little mouth on his chest started making sounds. Initially, it was a clicking noise, but it soon began forming words. It was a child's voice, eeny, high-pitched and sad. It won't work. It can't last. It's impossible. Never make it out alive. The phosphorus-topped waves of the ocean crashed noisily against the shore as a terrified Chris tried to wake Rob up. The woods, looking back. Chris awoke in a tent in the woods. Tiredness was writ large over her face as she grabbed a cigarette. They had taken this tent along on their trip, but didn't use it because the weather had been so good. It had clouded over the next morning when she and Rob took a walk along the beach, sharing polite pleasantries with other visitors. It was different that day. Not bad, just different. Despite the cold winds, they stood upon the rear deck on the ferry ride home, wrapped up in each other. Rob dropped her off up the street from her house and they shared a painful goodbye. The moment she entered home and saw her mother's concerned face, she knew she was busted. The school had called, complaining about the skipped classes. Mother had tried to reach Chris at Marcy's house, but neither she nor her mother knew of her whereabouts. This breach of trust worried her. She intuited that there was a boy involved in the matter and tried to warn Chris that she was too young to be throwing her life away like this. It was alive. Indeed, although she probably thought she was in love, she didn't understand the gravity of the emotion yet. This dismissal of her emotions angered Chris, and she furiously lashed out in response. It didn't help. She was grounded for the weekend and her phone privileges were taken away. On Monday, she was chaperoned to school by her father, while her mother picked her up when it ended. Her only solace was Rob, whom she told everything during a clandestine meeting in the parking lot. Not only was Chris under continuous surveillance, but her mother had booked an appointment with a gynecologist on Thursday. Her infection would be found out. Chris was at her wit's end, and on the verge of tears. That is when they made the plan. It seemed like a good idea at the time. They decided to execute the plan on Wednesday. Her mother went to do volunteer work at the church that day. Chris would keep everything ready and use that window to run away. She tried to act normal over the next couple of days as she packed her essentials. It wasn't easy to decide which of her countless belongings she should take. Every little trinket seemed emotionally significant in light of her decision to leave home. She ended up with a couple of cardboard boxes full of stuff and a few trash bags full of clothes, which she stashed in the basement. On Wednesday, her mother came to talk to her before leaving for the church. She had noticed her distant behavior and was worried. Chris assuaged her worries. It was simply the stress of her upcoming geometry finals. Once she had left, she called Rob. He soon arrived and parked up the alley. As he loaded her things onto his car, she left the note she had written on the kitchen table. She wanted her parents to know that she wasn't leaving because she was angry with them. It was simply time for her to leave. She had emptied her bank account and would have enough money to last her a while. Before leaving, she went to the backyard where her younger brother was playing with his friend and hugged him, much to the embarrassed confusion of the kid. Then she waved him goodbye and left. She crouched in the back seat of the car to avoid being seen. They drove until they reached the dirt trail that ran below Ravenna Park. Rob walked into the woods and quickly returned with Dave, who helped carry all their stuff into the woods. Dave recognized Chris and said that they used to be in French class together in grade 10. She remembered him, but that pretended she didn't. Dave didn't seem to mind. Walking through the woods felt like an adventure, as if they were going for an overnight camping trip. But Chris wouldn't return to the warm safety of her home the next morning. This was her home now. After following the trail for a while, they crossed over into the underbrush and past the campfire site. Finally, they found a suitable clearing to set up their humble dwellings. Dave helped them set up the tent, invited Chris to join their late-night campfire sessions whenever she liked, and then took his leave. She and Rob quietly entered the tent to enjoy each other's company. After all, he was the only one she wanted to be with. However, life in the woods wasn't always so rose-tinted. Rob had school to attend and a home to go back to, so she spent most of her time alone. She got used to the routine of staying up late and sleeping through the day, waiting for him to come. She looked at her watch now, the cigarette approaching its end. It was almost 2. Rob would be showing up in a couple of hours. She lazily walked out of the tent to freshen up. A sudden snap of a branch alerted her. Scared, she ran into the woods and came face to face with a strange sculpture tied to a tree. It was a collage of a smiling doll's head and pictures of a woman's naked breasts and genitals torn from some pornographic magazine. Together, they made a violently sexual image. It hadn't been there when she had walked by that tree a few moments before. Right then, someone came up behind her and called her name. She screamed. Thankfully, it was Rob. He had skipped the last 2 classes so he could spend a little more time with her. He had brought along a bunch of great stuff, but Chris was unsettled by the totemic sculpture. Although Rob said that he had seen similar things around and asked her not to worry, she was not reassured. She was afraid she wouldn't be able to survive like this. Chris looked at Rob and asked him to tell her that everything would be okay. He hugged her tightly. Yeah, everything will work out fine, I promise. Issue number 8, Lizard Queen, A Broken Tale. Keith wanted to score some weed and found his way to the house of the college guys. There was still a week of school before the summer vacations kicked in, but the season was already in session. It was a warm evening, so he bought himself a popsicle on his way to the grey house. Approaching the house, he realised the woman from his last visit was sitting on the doorstep. It raised that panicky feeling in his stomach again, making him want to turn back. But she had already seen him. Her face was swollen and her eyes were dull. She seemed stoned or drunk, but something else was also wrong. She complimented the new haircut he had gotten to fit the dress code at his new job at the Albertsons supermarket. It was better than the scraggly hippie look that everyone was wearing. She knew that he had come to buy drugs, but the college guys were not home. Only she was there with their dog, Faust, who now had a plaster on his leg. She noticed the popsicle and asked for a bite, which Keith grudgingly offered. But as she bit into it, a big piece broke off and fell to the ground. Faust ran up and ate it. This apparently trivial incident made her break down in tears. She felt that she was a complete mess, unable to do anything right. Not only had she wasted the popsicle, but Faust was not supposed to eat things like that. Not that his owners cared. They fed him all kinds of junk. A few days ago, when Faust was hit by a car, his owners were too busy partying to notice. It was she who stepped out and found him lying on the lawn, all busted up, and took him to the vet. Unsettled by her sudden overflow of emotions, Keith wanted to excuse himself and go home, but she pleaded with him to stick around. She suggested that they smoke a joint together. Then, without waiting for a reply, she turned and entered the house. Keith followed. The place was a mess. When she first moved in, she used to clean up intermittently, but she had had enough by now. She would leave as soon as she found a new place. The door to her room was marked with obscene graffiti and the words Lizard Queen. It was a play on her name, Eliza Liz Lizard. Inside, the walls were empty. All her art was gone. She said that had thrown most of it out because it would be too much to carry when she eventually moved. She was also sick of looking at it. Eliza asked Keith to roll the joint and lay down for a bit. As he rolled a thin, one-paper joint, he knew it was going to happen. He had had a girlfriend in 10th grade and had fooled around with a few girls in some parties, but he had never gone all the way. But he knew it was going to happen today. They were smoking the joint in somber silence when Eliza suddenly started laughing, startling Keith. She thought it was funny how seriously they were smoking the joint. She had almost forced Keith to come down there and reassured him that he could leave if he wanted. It wouldn't upset her. He wanted to stay. Eliza was glad. She pulled him closer and kissed him gently and asked him to lie down while she rolled another joint. That old panicky feeling rose in his stomach again, but he ignored it. She sat on top of him and started rocking back and forth as she rolled. She spoke about wanting to get out of the state and live somewhere closer to the desert, where it was hot and dry. About her father, who was stationed in Arizona when she was a kid and would take them on trips. But Keith didn't hear a thing. The warmth of her body permeated through their clothes onto his body and wrenched away all of his self-control. When she slipped out her tongue to lick the joint, he came. Furiously embarrassed, he excused himself to the bathroom, reassuring Eliza that he would be back, and cleaned himself up as best as he could. By the time he was ready, the college guys had returned. One of them was furious to see him in their house and threatened to beat him up, refusing to listen to anything he had to say. Thankfully, Bert was there to stop him, excusing his behavior on his drunken state. The incident unnerved Keith, and he decided that he would leave after saying goodbye to Eliza. But seeing her again changed his mind. She stood naked in the middle of the room. Candles had been lit, and a red scarf was draped over the lamp, changing the atmosphere of the entire room. She seemed to have changed too, her dark eyes looking focused and clear. As she gave him a hit of the joint and pulled him closer, he breathed in the unfamiliar scent rising from her body. He shed his clothes and lay on the bed as Eliza got on top and guided him inside her. Just like that, to his utter disbelief, they were having sex. They slowed down after a while and changed position under Eliza's direction, such that Keith was behind her. Caught in the throes of pleasure, she asked him to grab her tail in his hand. As they moved faster and faster, Eliza's moans rising in volume, the tail wriggled in his hand like a living thing. Suddenly, it broke. Keith was horrified, but Eliza was unfazed. It would grow back in time. After they had finished and calmed down a bit, Eliza wrapped him up in her arms and reassured him that it didn't hurt. She had hardly noticed when it had happened. She told him how good it felt to be with someone she liked, and how she knew he would return to her eventually. Her voice murmured to a whisper, and her breathing slowed as she gradually fell asleep. He laid awake in her embrace, listening to the voices upstairs, as Faust barked his head off in the background. I'm sorry, a prophecy fulfilled. Chris and Rob had spent a wonderful afternoon together, but it was time for him to go home. His mother had been upset with him for not spending time at home, and he didn't want to exacerbate things. He would return after 8 and would try to bring something good for her, maybe a bottle of wine. Chris smiled at the sweet gesture. She wasn't trying to be difficult. It was simply hard to let him go. She assured him that she would be okay by herself in the meanwhile. She had a book to keep her company. They parted ways after professing their love for each other. As Rob walked into the foliage, he found someone waiting for him. It was the person who had been lurking in the shadows, listening in on conversations. But Rob didn't know him, so he was shocked when he raised a metal rod and hit him across the face, drawing blood. Rob fell to the ground. Terror writ large on his face and tried to stop his assailant from hitting him again. He didn't even know him. It didn't work. He kept hitting Rob until his face was busted open and bloody. The assailant stood over his dead body, saying that he had to do it. He told me I had to do it. In response, the mouth on Rob's chest started speaking, but it was speaking to Chris, apologizing to her. I'm sorry it didn't work. Some distance away, Chris sat by her tent, reading her book. She was waiting for Rob to return. Issue number 9, Summer Vacation, Playing House. Chris stumbled through the woods by the fading glow of her flashlight. She was drunk. Branches hit her on the face and thorny stickers caught her clothes, but she kept going. She knew her destination and knew that Keith, the nice guy from biology class, would be waiting for her there. He was her knight in shining armor. The first time she saw him down at the campfire in the pit, she hadn't recognized him with his short haircut and starch white shirt, but he had recognized her immediately, despite her disheveled appearance. Since then, he had made it his mission to pull her out of her misery. Chris reached the pit and found Keith sitting there, looking up at her in wide-eyed wonder. She was too tired for small talk and addressed him directly. Was he ready? Why didn't they head off? Keith was embarrassed, and his fumbling response elicited some laughter and taunts from the rest of the people at the gathering. But Chris wasn't in the mood to keep any more secrets. It had been Keith's plan anyway. He had been asked to take care of a house near the woods. The owners were friends of his parents. All he had to do was feed the cat, water the plants, and keep everything marginally clean. He suggested that Chris could use it to freshen up and wash her clothes. He had repeated his suggestion multiple times until she had finally relented and agreed. When they reached the house, Keith asked her to wait outside so that he could check if everything was okay. He would switch on the porch light as a signal for Chris to come in. She was irritated by the elaborate Keith's elaborate planning, but agreed to wait outside, lighting a cigarette to pass the time. It was a while before the porch light went on. Inside, there was a table full of food waiting for her. Keith stood behind it with a broad smile on his face. Chris wasn't thrilled. She just wanted to freshen up and told Keith as much, but he wanted to make her a drink at least. Knowing her preference for gin and tonics, he had brought all the ingredients along. Once again, Chris had to relent. She sat down at the table and waited for the drink to arrive. There was a plate of sandwiches, a bowl of pretzels, and a container of onion dip. She loved onion dip, and despite declining to have any food initially, she was actually starving. She picked up a sandwich. As expected, it was a bologna sandwich with a piece of lettuce and some mayonnaise. Keith often brought extra food for her, wrapped in brown paper, like the school lunches her mum used to pack. She would always find these bologna sandwiches inside. Keith soon came back with the drink. It was well mixed and tasted clean and fresh. Chris could see how hard he was trying to please her, but she couldn't abandon her apathy. Her mind briefly flashed back to a more desperate time, with her gun aimed at her temple as she mourned the loss of all good things in her life. She decided she wouldn't fall back into self-pity again and started making small talk with Keith. It had been a while since Chris had been inside a house, let alone sitting at a table, having a drink out of a regular glass. The only other house she had been in since she had run away was Marcy's. They had grown up together and were best friends. After Rob disappeared, she was the only one Chris could think of turning to. She went over to her house very late one night and waited until all the lights were out before knocking on her window. They had a special signal to identify each other. Marcy was so shocked to see her that she had to be prompted into welcoming her inside. Chris hadn't been to her room in months, but it hadn't changed much. She did have some new albums, including David Bowie's Diamond Dogs, which her boyfriend Kyle had given to her. It was weird, but she was slowly getting into it. They had a great time that night. It felt like old times, sitting on the bed and talking for hours. Marcy put on Harvest by Neil Young, their favourite album, and asked Chris to tell her everything that had happened. For the first few days of Rob's disappearance, Chris tried to think of it logically. Perhaps he had been grounded by his mother or something, but as days passed, things became difficult. She didn't leave the tent for days on end and took to wearing one of Rob's shirts, which still smelled like him. She smoked his cools after her own cigarettes were finished, and when they were over, she sifted through the ashtray and smoked the butts. She had run out of food and water, but was too scared to try and make her way through the woods alone. She would sit outside the tent all night and hear terrified shrieks emanating from all around, screaming for mercy from some invisible assailant. There were always footprints around the tent in the morning, and new creepy sculptures hanging from the trees. If not for Rob's father's gun, which he had taught her how to shoot, she wouldn't have survived. One day, she heard footsteps approaching her tent and a loud snap from someone stepping on a branch. She raised her gun, but was given pause by someone calling her out by name. Was it Rob? It was Dave. He had come along to see how she was doing. He said that he was unaware of what had happened to Rob, but was happy to bring her food and show her an easy way down to Ravenna Park. He advised her on how to get to the nearest grocery store and warned her to stay on the tracks at all times. He was really nice, and Chris felt slightly sorry for being creeped out by him on their first meeting. Down at the grocery store, she had enough money to buy all the food she needed. did. Then she got a stranger to buy her some wine, which she drank sitting by the train tracks until she got sick. Back in Keith's company, her gin and tonic had run out and she asked him to make her another drink. He quickly obliged. Chris had already been drunk on wine and now she was completely loaded. The sound of the rain outside reminded her of the first time she had skipped school with Rob. When Keith returned with another drink, she began the story where she had left off. At the end of her visit to Marcy's house, she noticed her yearbook and found Rob's photo in it. She begged Marcy to let her cut it out, reasoning that she didn't have any pictures of him. After being relentlessly badgered, she reluctantly agreed. But the real fallout happened a couple of weeks later. Marcy had been to a Bowie concert and had pictures she wanted to show her, but Chris was weirded out by the garish makeup on their faces and ended up calling them creepy and dumb. That broke the dam of patience that Marcy had apparently built with regard to Chris's behaviour. She berated her childhood best friend for having a messed up life and not caring for anyone else. Her temper settled down fast enough, but the damage was already done. The last time she tried to visit Marcy, she was having a party. Chris stood in dark for a while, staring at the house before she left. That was the first time she went to the pits, their nightly campfire gathering, and she was finally where she belonged, with a bunch of loser sick kids down at the pit. Keith didn't like the way she described them. They had always been nice to her, helping her every step of the way. Feeling embarrassed and guilty for being called out like that, Chris tried to take her leave, but she was too drunk to stand up and almost fell down. She needed to lie down first. Keith held her and led her to a bed. She fell forward into its big, soft expanse and wrapped herself up in the funny smelling, shiny bedspread. She rolled over into the dark and was gone. There was a short dream where she found herself on the beach with Rob by her side. He pointed at something in the water, and then he was gone. She was back in the room with Keith by her side, his hand moving needily on her belly. Her drunk mind looked at the cheap, glittery stars on the ceiling and saw them spin like a pinwheel into her dreams, becoming waves in the ocean. At her feet lay a barrage of broken glass and other grotesque refuse. But she wasn't afraid. She knew her destination. She crossed the barrier of garbage and leapt into the ocean, swimming out beyond the breakers. There, in the calm, undulating waters, she rolled onto her back and floated. She wasn't scared anymore. She kept floating. Issue number 10. Dream Girl, A Rude Awakening. Keith was dreaming. He was in the dirty bathroom at the college kids' house, looking at pornographic magazines. Eliza's paintings were pasted on the wall. He noticed a bathtub in the corner, its curtain pulled close. He walked up and drew it open. Chris lay in the water, completely naked. Her eyes opened wide in shock when she saw him. She opened her mouth and started screaming something. Goa owa! Goa owa! He looked down and saw tadpoles swimming near her crotch. The harsh sound of the alarm woke him up. It was still raining outside. He quickly engaged in his morning routine, shaved, showered, covered his midsection in a bandage, dressed in the mandated work uniform, rolled a couple of thin joints for the day, had a breakfast bowl of Cap'n Crunch, and rode out on his bicycle. He didn't want to visit the McCroskey's house, but he had to. He was lucky that it was isolated. If the neighbours ever found out about its new inhabitants, he would be in a lot of trouble. Inside, it was hot and stuffy and smelled really bad. The heating was turned up, some of them sleeping while a bunch of were watching Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein on the TV. Keith wanted to switch it off and ask them to get out of the house. Instead, he went into the next room. Someone was sleeping right outside Chris's room, wrapped up in a blanket. The door was locked, so he surmised she was still asleep inside. She always made sure to not be around when Keith came by. It was probably for the best. He didn't have anything to say to her anyway. The house was overrun with junk, so Keith tried to clean up as best as he could. It barely made a dent in the cavalcade of garbage. There was time to smoke a joint before he left for work. There was a window in the garage by which he got stoned. Roaches and matches collected on the windowsill as a marker of the passing days. It was his secret hideaway. He looked at the car that the owners had left behind and fantasized, as he often did, of hitting the road in it and heading south. The keys were in the kitchen. As the buzz of the joint took hold, Keith slipped back to the day he had first brought Chris here. He had meticulously planned that get-together, which had slipped away within a moment. A while after falling asleep, she started making strange noises, prompting Keith to lie down beside her in an attempt to comfort her. He had heard her calling out for Rob. The next day, upon returning to the house after work, he found her bag leaning against the bathroom door. It was closed, but not locked. He entered the bathroom, baying against his better judgment, and was hit by the overwhelming stench of alcohol. She was in the bathtub, skinny, broken, and messed up. Seeing her like that made Keith want to cry. He tried to lift her up, but her skin tore off to his touch. She opened her eyes in a daze and asked him to go away, go away. Keith's mind returned to their school days. The third period biology classes were the highlight of his day because of Chris. She was sweet and perfect, haloed out of reality in his fantastic idea of her. He would stare at her while films about human reproduction played on the screen, films that simplified sex by limiting it to the clinical act of reproduction. The actual act of making love was never discussed. At the thought of sex, his mind shifted to Eliza. A week after he had been with her, he got some tiny bumps on his ribs. He tried to get rid of them with medication and even attempted to cut them off. Neither approach worked. Gradually, they grew tiny purple-grey tails, reminding him of tadpoles. As a kid, while visiting his cousins in Missouri, they had tried to keep tadpoles as pets, wishing to see them turn into frogs, but they soon forgot about them and the tadpoles died. When they started to stink, his uncle made them dump their carcasses in the field. Keith had felt terribly sorry for them. His train of thought was interrupted by a distant pop, pop, pop sound. It was a strange time to burst firecrackers, but he didn't have time to worry about that. He had to get to work. If only Eliza would show up again. He was buzzed on half a joint stocking shelves at the supermarket when she had suddenly appeared. Keith had cut his hand on the box cutter he was using and hadn't noticed. She saw it and cleaned it up meticulously while he gawked at her beauty. She looked healthy and happy. The bruises on her face had disappeared and there was colour in her skin. Her eyes were dark and clear, free of the sadness that had haunted them before. She explained that she had moved out of the old house and was living with an old friend from school until something permanent could be arranged. They took a moment to take in each other's presence, happy to have met again. Before leaving, she wrote her number on the back of his hand. It was a happy day, but all his enthusiasm disappeared when he returned to the McCroskey house. Chris had invited everyone from the pit to stay there. They had made toast and scrambled eggs, but under it all, the rotten smell of the woods still lingered. Chris looked at him, but her eyes were dead and empty. That was the last time he saw her. It was time to leave for work. Keith added the burnt roach to his collection and walked out into the rain. That's when he realised that the window to Chris's room was open. She always kept the shades closed. Something was wrong. He ran to the front door but paused before entering again. He didn't want to do this. The house was still too warm, but the smell had changed now. Was it the smell of firecrackers? Keith dissociated as he walked closer to the people lying on the floor. He could see himself approach the bodies, which lay completely still. He wanted to believe that they were sleeping. The person lying before him, Roy, had a hole in his head. Keith's ears started ringing. Beyond it, he heard someone crying. Somebody was crying somewhere very far away. Issue number 11. Rick, the Dick, the Shadow in the Woods. Rick, the Dick. Holstrom had been part of the chess club. After catching the bug, he started living in the woods. Although he had never managed to become part of the gathering at the pits, he was always present, watching and listening. Dave stood in line at a KFC, ordering a chicken bucket. His presence seemed to make everyone uncomfortable, but only the man standing behind him spoke out angrily, demanding that he leave. Despite his girlfriend's attempts to calm him and Dave's polite replies, he threatened to drag him out. So Dave took out Chris's gun and pointed it at him. He assaulted the guy, forcing him to kneel to his knees and open his mouth. Then he spit in it. That's how easy it was to get infected. He was amused by the girlfriend's tearful concern for the man and considered taking her down to the woods for a few days to give her something to really cry about. Instead, he just picked up his order and left. Back in the woods, amidst a litter of pornographic magazines and bone shards, sat Rick. He was making another totem to hang from the trees when a sharp snap caught his attention. It was Dave with a bucket of KFC. Rick was delighted to see the food. He was starving. He had been worried when Dave hadn't shown up for a few days. He was almost out of food and was afraid that Dave had permanently ditched him. He asked if he had sorted things out with Chris, which Dave refused to answer, instead offering to play a game of chess. Rick was overjoyed. He loved chess. Whatever they did with the girls in the depths of night was good, but chess was still the best. Rick was happily munching on his chicken when Dave shot him in the head head from behind. Then he sat himself down. This was where it would end. He had been stupid to let things go this far. He didn't have a choice anymore. He put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. Driving south. Escape. Eliza sat naked on a pink towel, drawing something in her sketchbook. Her tail wagged, making a fan shape in the dirt. She was the one for Keith. He knew that now. They were sitting on a hilltop, looking onto the arid Arizona desert. In retrospect, this seemed impossible. He had called her just before leaving. They took the car from McCroskey's garage. He took the wheel. Eliza sat beside him while Carla and Doug sat in the back. Everyone else was dead. Keith and Doug had found Carla hidden in the bathroom. It took her a while to stop crying before she could tell them what had happened. She had seen Dave knocking on Chris's door. He was apologizing about something that had happened the previous night and asking her to open the door. He assured her that he was not going to hurt her. Eventually, he started kicking the door to try and break it. When she saw him pull out a gun, Carla ran and hid in the bathroom. Then she heard the shots. Carla was in tears again, telling them about Dave's crush on Chris, how he used to stare at her and get her drunk. But all Keith could think about was the McCroskeys returning from vacation and walking into the carnage they had left behind. They dropped Carla and Dave off near Olympia. She had a sister there, and they would stay with her for a while. It was a tearful goodbye. Although they were his friends, Keith was glad to see them go. He and Eliza drove all night, looking for a place where no one would ever mess with them again. At some point, Eliza fell asleep on Keith's shoulder. That is when his dam finally burst. He wept as he thought of his parents waiting for him at dinner, trying to reach out to his old friends, and eventually hearing about the massacre at McCroskey's house. He thought of the kids who had run off into the woods. Sooner or later, they would get caught or die. He thought of Chris, who had managed to evade Dave's rampage, and hoped she would find a way to be happy again. The dark roads and the weight of their decision was starting to weigh heavy on the sleep-deprived Keith when Eliza woke up again. They moved into a dirt road leading into the hills and stopped at a place that Eliza pointed out. She seemed to have a plan. They gathered up their stuff and headed up the hill to catch the sunrise. There they sat now, naked, in love and content. Eliza called Keith over and showed him the drawing she had made. He was in it, flying away from all the messed up stuff he had told her about. He had been awed by her art from the very first beginning, but he still didn't know what had happened to all the art in her room. Eliza seemed hesitant to discuss it, but she did. She had run away from home multiple times, trying to get away from her abusive stepfather. She had even camped out in the woods with some friends, but it was too scary for her. Then she met the college guys in Ravenna Park, who invited her to stay in the empty room in their basement. So, she had moved in and spent time working on her art and helping to keep the house clean. Things went awry during a big party that had somehow spilled into Eliza's room. Someone slipped her a downer drug, which messed with her head. The attendees taunted her with lurid suggestions, but things didn't go bad until someone started writing on her artwork. She scratched the guy while attempting to stop him. He hit her back, knocking her out. She had woken up naked, sick and sore between her legs. They had written nasty stuff all over her body. She had thrown out all her art that day. Issue number 12, The End. Keith was dreaming. He was surrounded by the debris from his past. Everything from snakes and tadpoles to bones and broken popsicles. Then it all moved away. He was staring at nothingness when a sliver of light appeared. Was it a mirror? It was the widening dissection across the chest of a frog-like child lying on the forest floor. Keith cursed his fate as it withered before his eyes. Dee and Todd were there with his yearbook, taunting him with pictures of all his friends. A bunch of rotted, distorted faces looked back at him. Keith pointed at a particularly unsettling one and asked who it was. They laughed and said it was him. Keith left them behind and climbed down into a hole, disregarding his friends' mock warnings. He was in a crevasse filled with the wreckage of cottages and tents. Refuse water poured from a sewage pipe and flowed like a river through its valley. It was the bad place he often visited in his dreams, where things were barely held together by tape and string. It was filled with garbage, glass, shit, torn up magazines, cigarette butts, crumpled beer cans, and Chris. She knew he was watching her. He apologized. He hadn't wanted to hurt her. He wanted to make her like him, but it didn't matter anymore. Chris pulled up her foot and picked out a scroll of paper from the slit of her wound. It rolled open to reveal the picture of a lizard, which shifted into the image of a beautiful rock formation standing upon a mountaintop. It doesn't always have to be bad, Chris said. Sometimes things work out. But Eliza's voice was calling from beyond, and Keith had to wake up. They were in the motel room they had rented so that they could have a shower and get a good night's sleep. Eliza had had a bad dream and was terrified. She turned her weeping face to him and asked him to tell her that everything would be okay. Keith held her face in his hands and reassured her everything would be okay because they were together. They would drive around and see all the cool places she had mentioned, like Monument Valley, the beautiful rock formation that had popped up in his dream. They had enough money to last them a couple of weeks. Then they would settle down in a quiet little town. He would get a job and she would work on her art all day. They would also get a Kachina doll like the one her real father had gifted her as a child. They would hang it over their bed. His words soothed Eliza, and she agreed to go back to sleep, turning around so that he could wrap her up. Before they could slumber off, she asked Keith if he loved her. She wanted to hear him say it out loud, so he told her that he would love her forever, no matter what. She smiled and replied that she would too, no matter what. With that, they drifted off to sleep, warmed by each other's bodies, buoyed by their scents. Way up inside, it got huge and dark, and then the pictures came in. Then they were gone. Somewhere far away, Chris was dreaming. She was floating in water, surrounded by the debris from her past. Snakes, doll heads, cigarette butts, trash bags full of clothes. Then a hand floated to the surface and touched her thigh. Dave's face peeked from behind it. She screamed in terror. The hand belonged to the old man she had hitched a ride with. He was trying to wake her up. Chris had told him that she was headed to the beach, so he had stopped at the intersection where he would turn away from it. She thanked him and quickly disembarked from the vehicle, declining his offer to spend the rest of the night at his house. As the car drove away, she brought out her almost empty bottle of vodka and chugged its remains. She had a long walk ahead of her. At least it wasn't raining, like the last time she had walked through the woods to her tent. She was glad to be out of the McCroskey house and wanted nothing more than to crawl back into her safe and dry hideout. But upon reaching it, she found it destroyed and trashed, a threatening totem of bones tied at its pole. She was sifting through the wreckage, frantically looking for her gun and diary when Dave had arrived. He took her to his fort. It smelled like rotten meat, but Chris was just grateful to be out of the rain. He made her hot chocolate on a tiny propane burner and invited her to stay with him. Flustered by the sudden offer, Chris told him about the McCroskey house, stating that she would seek shelter there. The very next day, Dave brought along a bunch of his friends to the house. That is how it became their communal residence. She spent most of her time barricaded in her room, reading the few good books she had found in the house. But she did make time for Dave, who came along every evening with booze and food. Initially, they talked about books, movies, and stuff like that, but soon their conversations became more personal. One day, when Chris expressed her desire to go back to her old self, Dave said that he never wanted to return to being a normal teenager. He had been regularly beaten up and ostracized by his schoolmates and felt that anything was better than that. In Dave's eyes, Chris was different from the rest because she used to treat him nicely. While she may have been outwardly polite, Chris knew that she had also thought of him and his friends as losers and creeps. Anyway, on their last night at the McCroskey house, when Dave showed up with a bottle of vodka, Chris didn't consider it to be anything out of the ordinary, but he was nervous and was drinking unusually heavily. When sufficiently inebriated, he confessed his feelings for her and attempted to kiss her. Initially taken aback, she pushed him away and told him that she did not feel the same way about him. The situation became intensely uncomfortable and she asked him to leave. He had obeyed without a word, but he was soon back, knocking at her door. He was too drunk to stand up and kept blabbering on about how much he loved her. If he couldn't have her, no one could. That's when she had noticed the gun in his hand. It was her gun, and just like that, everything had fallen into place. She realized that he was the one who had been making and leaving the creepy sculptures around the woods, who had been stalking her in Rob's absence, leaving footprints outside her tent, and who had destroyed and trashed it in an attempt to get her to move in with him. She somehow managed to calm him down and close the door behind her. Then she escaped into the rain, leaving an open window behind. Meanwhile, a long walk finally concluded. In the soft light of dawn, she saw at the beach and thought of the many different people she had visited this place with. She had made a ritual out of running across the sand to the rock formation jutting out of the sea. It was her favorite place on earth. This time, she didn't run. She lay down on the ground, exhausted, but sleep was nowhere to be found. As the day wore on, more and more people came to the beach. As she saw them walking, talking, and laughing laughing together, she thought of returning home. She knew her parents would be happy to see her. She would take a long shower, wear her soft blue nightgown, and have her favorite food for dinner: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and salad with Thousand Island dressing. The thought of food churned her hunger, but her backpack was empty except for a can of soda and half a packet of chips. There was also the picture of Rob she had taken from Marcy's yearbook. Looking at it was difficult. It didn't even really look like him. She walked to the edge of the water and dug a hole in the wet sand. She thought about how, once, she knew every inch of Rob's body and how all of it was slowly fading away, how much she wanted him to be there with her and how she knew that was not possible, how much fun they had had when they came down here together. She would remember that time when they were both young and he was hers to love. She buried the photograph in the hole. Later, when the sun was almost down and Chris was slipping in and out of a wasted stupor, a middle-aged woman approached her. She had noticed she was alone and invited her to join their party for supper. They were going to get a fire started to roast some hot dogs. They had coleslaw, potato salad, and pop to go with it. Chris respectfully declined the offer. Nonetheless, the sweet lady let her know where they were stationed, in case she changed her mind. She willed herself not to start crying. How long could she last out here in the cold and dark? Chris tried to imagine how it would feel to join the woman and her party. She saw smiling faces gathered around a fire, welcoming her amidst themselves. She was starving and would love to have a hot dog right now. Suddenly, Dave's twisted face flashed to mind. No, not yet, she thought. I'm not ready yet. Instead, she stripped down and waded into the water. It was almost too cold. She often thought of ending it all, but then she would look around and wonder how she could give all of it up. Despite the freezing temperature, she dove in and swam beyond the breakers. After a while, feeling a little warmer, she rolled over and faced the sky. It was a beautiful, deep, dark blue as the first stars bloomed across its expanse. She felt that she could stay there forever. Conclusion. Black Hole was a 12-issue limited series published between 1995 and 2005, initially by Kitchen Sink Press and then by Fantagraphics. Written and illustrated by Charles Burns, this cult classic graphic novel is equal parts a horror story and a coming-of-age tale, telling the stories of a disparate set of teens trying to survive an outbreak of a sexually transmitted disease that only affects teenagers and manifests in strange bodily growths. Rendered in stark black and white through bold line drawings reminiscent of woodcut etchings, the art style provokes a visceral reaction. The absence of any intervening colours sets a dire mood as the teenage characters indulge in sex, drugs, and intermittent violence. But it is the pauses between these events, where the characters reflect on their actions and contemplate the strangeness of their existence, that the story really shines. Indeed, most of the violence is only hinted at. The central mystery takes place in the peripheries, while the plot primarily dwells upon the developments in the lives of the two main characters, Keith and Chris. A motif of parallels runs through the story. Dialogue patterns are repeated between different characters in different contexts, and images overlap through dreams and nightmares, lending a strange continuity between their experiences and relationships. Black Hole is the story of encountering reality. It confronts the strangeness of the human body, the power and fragility of love, and the characteristic effervescence of life. Bitterness engulfs certain characters, reducing them to cruel creatures who resort to violence and manipulation. Some characters drown in apathy, beaten down by the repeated blows of fate. But paralleling that cynicism is a relentless hope that keeps the characters afloat. A dream of a better future is always alive, even in the most depressing situations. A window of escape kept open for the characters to notice and act upon. All in all, Black Hole is an unsettling depiction of the social and psychological alienation that characterizes the adolescent experience, and a gripping exploration of the fear of contagion, which has acquired renewed relevance in our post-pandemic world.